Hello, and thank you for allowing me to discuss my project work with you today. For my presentation, I'm going to talk about the public outreach project with the University of Edinburgh and the Aeclanum project in the Roman city of Aeclanum, situated in modern Passo de Mirabella, Aeclano in southern Italy, and how it has contributed to the local engagement with the archaeological site and found new audiences in the United Kingdom through an art exhibition of the work that I created there. This project explored communication between archaeologists and the general public through illustrations to educate people and promote the site by creating a cohesive body of outreach material through a comic medium. The project culminated in a bespoke comic book called Vita Romana and for Aeclanum, the archaeological park, and supplemental learning materials, which have since acquired new utility in the context of the current pandemic. I will discuss in this paper the project aims, methodology, and outcomes, and conclude with some new opportunities we are exploring. This presentation discusses this case study project as a launching pad for understanding the complexities of project managing a public outreach program from conception to delivery and analysis. The archaeological site of Aeclanum is situated in the southern Italian territory of Irpinia near the river Calore. Founded by the Samnite people of the 4th century BCE, it remained continuously occupied until the late Antique period. You may not be familiar with Aeclanum, even though it is a prominent city of the region. Some argue perhaps even a capital city. So I will briefly relate some of the key historical events that took place there to give it some context. Aeclanum appears in the historical record due to its capture by the Roman general Sulla during the social wars of the early 1st century BCE and received municipium status afterwards. The urban area of Aeclanum is approximately 22 hectares, encircled by a stone wall in Opus Incertum, which was built after receiving municipium status. Aeclanum later received a colonial status under Hadrian in the 120 CE, perhaps signifying a special relationship between the emperor and the community due to its prominence on the Via Appia, a major road connecting Rome to southern Italy. The city has since then became a bishopric in the late antiquity, with a very early Christian baptistry still visible on the site. Aeclanum was largely untouched and free from modern encroachment, with no systematic exploration or analysis having been undertaken since the 1950s. What was discovered was a bath complex, a macellum, which is a wet market, and several domestic buildings and other features in that earlier excavation, but no geophysical or computational analysis had been carried out subsequently. With this in mind, we had the opportunity to explore multimodal approaches for reconstructing the site, which were included in the public outreach. After a preliminary season in 2016, where the existing finds and work were surveyed, excavations and restoration continued through 2017 to 2019 throughout the site, focusing on four main sectors of the city, which were Bath Complex with multiple phases and uses of rebuilding, the city's theater, now stripped to its foundations, the Forum and surrounding structures, as well as a section along the Via Appia. From a local engagement perspective, the archaeological park was not well provided for. It had no recent materials in place for visitors, including site signage, explanatory maps, or really anything for children. The local and regional primary schools had no activities that related to Aeclanum specifically, though the site was recognized as abstractly significant to the identity of those in the region. The historical narrative of the archaeological site was essentially unknown. We began a systematic approach described by one site director, Fernando de Simone, as building up brick by brick with an overall trajectory and package of outreach materials for three target audiences. The first was site materials for open days. We created materials for the park staff that could easily be reproduced and continue to use on site with school groups during their visits as a resource after the conclusion of the excavation. In certain areas, we emphasized how the archaeology could and was being interpreted by site specialists. A primary objective of the creative materials was the exploration and understanding by the children of how this material was relevant to their lives. To that end, a special child focused open day was held annually where they would be surveyed for feedback anonymously, and we would be able to assess which aspects of the materials the children liked best. This guided what educational materials would be provided to the staff later on to run activities. The second was classroom outreach. Our second aim to create in class materials to support further exploration of the site was for primary age students and sometimes high schoolers as well. These materials included an illustrated short story, a comic, Vita Romana, both telling stories that centered around the Bath complex at Aeclanum, as this was one of the loci of excavations during each season. And both would feature the same two characters who were also featured in the other resources and activities for the open days. The third was our online audience. A third aim was to create a social media communication strategy and bespoke website to disseminate our activities to an international audience. We wanted to expand the reach of our outreach and launch the comic to those beyond the catchment areas of Irpinia in a way that would promote the site and increase visitors and visibility, as well as an awareness of the archaeology of the region. Ultimately, we wanted to bring more social awareness and support to the site. With consultations between project directors, local schools, and government, we developed a program that would have many branches to address the aims that we had set forth. The reciprocal nature of our communications with key members of the community meant that we would be able to fulfill one of the fundamental aims of public engagement, which is generating mutual benefit through listening and adapting. To this end, for the first year project, I created infrastructure, site materials, which included comic characters Neratia Prima and Caius Aegius Rufus. We based them on inscriptions found in Aeclanum of notable Roman families, though the characters are fictional. These characters were integrated into nearly all of the printed materials and games for the site. These included didactic games, children's sitemap, information panels, and activities, all of which fulfilled Archaeology Passport. Because of the open pathways for communication between schools and government, and the promotional efforts to publicize the excavation of the open days, we had strong showings of visitors to them, averaging around 350 to 400 visitors each year. We continued to survey the children as we went and to develop the engagement program even further and refine it as we delivered it. It was through this ongoing action and response dialogue that we gathered feedback from local children for the comic that I would be producing about Aeclanum. Since the materials we were making were centered around the bath complex, I wanted to find a way for them to have a voice in what outreach material they would receive. So we created a survey delivered at the end of the open day in 2018. They voted on the style of comic and voiced a strong preference for the scavenger hunts we had integrated into the Passport of Archaeology for that year. The comic characters were the central figures in the scavenger hunt, and the children, though through a course of activity, would find the missing doll of Naratia's sister, pictured in the tree. The input guided the work I would deliver in 2019, and over the course of the year in the off season, I continued to work on the comic and use social media to share the progress. As the artist and of the comic and a classical archaeologist, my experience with the material culture of the Roman period was instrumental in creating the content for Vita Romana. The visual elements are all derived from research conducted in person at archaeological sites of the region and museums and in discussion with site specialists. I conducted research and included a survey of children's books and Roman archaeological site daily life guides, as well as comics about the classical past. I relied on research of similarly sized Roman cities in southern Italy, as well as material culture that came from them, housed in museums that includes Pompeii, Herculaneum, Bosco Reale, and Aplantis as visual reference material. Though the frescoes from these sites date to the first century BC into the late first century CE, they were still relevant, and we felt that they were geographically close, and we could have a reasonable estimation that perhaps a wealthy family in a site like Aeclanum might have something similar at this period. Um, Even though it was 100 years later, the style of art was sort of integrated into different elements of the home. And other elements of consideration included more windows, and as that reflected the increase in glass production in this period as an intentional difference between the way Aeclanum in the second century is presented versus other materials which would present Pompeii in the first century CE. And glass was more common in buildings in the second century, and it brought in larger or broader ranges of lighting opportunities. So I incorporated new finds as well from the excavations at Pompeii from 2018 to 2019, and those are featured here. And that includes Leda and the Swan from the House of Leda and the Swan, the Narcissus fresco, as well as the Orion mosaic excavated from the House of Jupiter. Objects from the scenes are referenced in similar examples like the silver diningware shown here from a tomb excavated in Pompeii as well. One unique feature of Aeclanum's archaeological past was that was included in the comic was the architecture of the bath complex. Due to the topography of the city, the bath complex was buttressed along the hillside, and I used the excellent reconstructions done by Josef Suchek to inform the artwork that I was doing. To imagine the route the women would take in the comic, I walked along several portions of the city that still had walls and Roman roads in place, and I followed this until I reached the House of the Peristyle, which is an elite home that had a peristyle courtyard. And I used this route and the experience of walking through it to sort of create the comics urban space and how the characters were going to walk through it themselves. And the house of the peristyle was the foundation for the home of the Narati family in the comic. So, another focus of the narrative of Vita Romana was highlighting Roman women's religious experiences and perspectives. A significant body of evidence illustrates the religious agency of women in portraits, funerary reliefs, and dedications. In these media, they use conventions of language and representation that, for the most part, perform what is expected of them in the context that they're presented. Vita Romana reflects a nuanced representation of women in comic form. To remain historically reliable, we kept the characters grounded within epigraphic evidence. For instance, the character of Alia is a fictional priestess serving the regional deity Mephitis, uh, recorded in a dedication in Aeclanum by a Sia Magia, priestess of Mephitis, in the mid 2nd century CE. Foreign deities are present at Aeclanum and also represented in this part of the narrative at the Bath complex. As a priestess of Isis, Kentria Longina is being shown dressed in the changing room. The narrative includes as much of the religious diversity attested in the city as I could possibly put in, even in a small town like Aeclanum, where you wouldn't necessarily assume there is such a religious diversity. To judge from the epigraphy, it was very broad, and there are many gods from all different places worshipped there. The story itself revolves around the Bath complex, and the narrative within the story is that of the Niobids. And it was important to show a large number of the enslaved population as well, working in the Bath complex. And these would have been the servi publici, the public slaves. These enslaved people were owned by the city and worked in public buildings in religious contexts as well, just to name a few. Uh, that they are publicly owned people is not made explicit in the comic, but it is alluded to. They are all dressed in similar clothing as to appear as a cohesive and silent workforce. However, they would also have been dressed in similar, or they have also been dressed in similar ways to the other enslaved people in the comic as an artistic liberty, to show the reader that they are all part of the same social class and depicted in all spheres, domestic and public. The most commonly depicted enslaved person was Myrtis, a woman shown who dresses the Narati daughters and escorts the women around town. And she is a symbol of the family's wealth, effectively, and a status symbol to them. Myrtis is silent throughout, though in the background she sees and greets people and appears to engage in her own relationships with the people in the market and in the baths. And it was important to me to present her as somebody with some agency, though she's not being vocal about what's on her mind. There's a lot of expression I've tried to imbue in her eyes and how she's perceptive and engaging with the scenes around her. So we launched the comic in July 2019, and from the data we captured through Google and Facebook analytics from the launch date, which had been advertised online for a little while, we received 100,000 impressions, meaning individual feeds the advertisement was displayed in. Not necessarily they clicked on it, but that they saw it. And for the first 10 days, there was over 2,000 visits to the through the comic link, through this advertisement, and to the hosting website. For those wishing to download Vita Romana on archaeokids.com, we asked them to answer a few questions to get a sense of who our audience was. Using the data from the questionnaire, the majority of downloads were from the United States and the United Kingdom, and downloaded by interested members of the public as well as homeschooling educators, and as well university teachers and other people in the educational sphere. And so they formed the majority of the downloaders, which was interesting and the subject of an upcoming article. So lastly, the public outreach at Aeclanum and the art of Vita Romana and other illustrations commissioned for the project were introduced to new audiences and featured in a exhibition entitled Illustrating Ancient History, Bringing the Past to the Present at the University of Cambridge's Museum of Classical Archaeology, running from November 2020 to January 21st. In collaboration with Dr. Javier Jimenez Martinez and Zofia Greaves, we created an exhibition that explored the different ways artists can engage with archaeology. The exhibition was developed pre-COVID and later adapted to meet the needs of social distancing, including an online format, which arguably broadened the audience and appeared to be very well received as well. So that brings us to my next steps. And the next steps will be finalizing the package of materials to accompany the comics that tackle themes like trade networks, enslaved people in urban environments, as well as rural environments, and then urban religion and the city. So a lot of kind of meaty subjects to get invested in, and they require they were worked really well as games, and I'm excited to sort of explore them and translate that into teaching materials that can be open source and downloaded for free. And lastly, we will be hoping to try and find some funding to create Latin versions of these materials, as well as additional learning guides and materials, again, free for online download as well. So, wrapping up, the project was really quite large and utilized all available types of social media and local public engagement tools, including surveys, open days, in class teaching, and online resources. And the longer term impacts of the work done was impacted by COVID-19, as with everything else. So the site visits and classroom outreach were paused, and we don't have any sense of what the impact was immediately afterwards. So none of the data could really be reliable to show what this did, if anything. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the future sort of numbers are and how these materials sort of move around and what we can do with them. So thank you all so much for your time and the opportunity to discuss the characters of Vita Romana and the site of Aeclanum. Thank you.